Alrighty, we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for another episode, if that's the right word, of NCVC's Countdown to Portland, an NTI webinar series. Today's topic will be on labor trafficking within the H2A program. And if you could just go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks so much. So just for a couple of housekeeping items before we get started, just so everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared online as well afterwards in the next week or so. If you're having any technical issues regarding anything, please feel free to send a private chat message to Dash Coleman, who you can find in the attendee list. We also want to note that attendance certificates and CE credits for these webinars will not be provided, so we apologize for that in advance. If you need captioning, please go ahead and click on the Show Captions button, which you will see at the bottom of your screen next to the Q&A. And speaking of the Q&A, please go ahead and submit all of your questions through the Q&A box. Questions will be answered most likely at the end of the presentation, and please make sure to put them in the Q&A box. We will not be monitoring the chat for any questions, just to keep them all in one place. And the next slide, please. While we are here, we also want to flag for you all that our 2024 National Training Institute is coming up this September. We will be in Portland, Oregon from September 18th to the 20th. We do have CE credits available at that conference, as well as over 60 workshop sessions and a bunch of plenaries. Standard registration is available through August 13th. So you can go ahead and go to victimsofcrime.org/NTI or scan the QR code here as well to learn more about that. And more information about NTI will also be available in the follow-up email that is sent. Next slide, please. Thank you. And once again, while we have you here, we'd like to invite you to join us at next month's NTI webinar, which will be on taking guns away from domestic violence offenders and keeping them away, which will be on Wednesday, July 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And that registration link will be circulated in the next week or so. And lastly, I want to go ahead and pass it off to our presenter today, who is Leo Lopez, who is an outreach manager at the Indiana Legal Services. We are so excited to have you today. Thank you so much. And here you go.
Thank you, and thank you guys for having me. Like Krista said, my name's full name is Leonel Lopez Macias Paredes, but I go by Leo, just a lot easier. So just a little bit about me. And by the way, I'm not going to be able to see the chat just because of the way that sharing screen and everything works. But yeah, so a little bit about me. I am a former farm worker of 10 years. I am an immigrant, moved here when I was 10 years old. And so my parents are still, around and are still working through the immigration process. So this work is near and dear to my heart, and, working with workers' rights and immigrant rights is very important. I've also presented at conferences such as the Freedom Network Conference. I've presented at on the same sort of topic, labor trafficking and farm worker rights. I've also presented at I forgot. Anyway, and at other ones. But yeah, we'll continue. All right, so training goals for this presentation are going to be, so we're going to do a brief overview of farm workers and the H2A program, for those of you who might not know what an H2A program is. Vulnerability of farm workers, issues within the H2A program, labor trafficking in H2A, and then what to do. Because, I'm not going to put you just with the problem and not give you a solution, or one of the solutions. There's many. So just a brief history about farm workers. So as we know, our country has a dark history. So pre-1865, ag labor was slave labor. Southern farmers in Georgia, Virginia, you name it, used slave labor to be able to provide for their farms at no cost at all. Then 1865 comes, 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. And then from that period, I would say all the way to mid 1960s, Jim Crow laws forced former slaves and their descendants into ag due to debt and sharecropping. So, farm labor has always had this dark history of exploitation. And then in the 1930s, we've got a deportation of over 500,000 Mexican Americans during the Great Depression, when everything was at an all-time low. And then 1935, the NLRA and Social Security Act are both passed. NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, protects collective bargaining, and then the Social Security Act is the unemployment insurance compensation, and old age and disability benefits. Both of them exclude ag labor. Then, and this will be kind of like the whole theme. You'll see that over and over again, ag labor gets excluded over and over again, allowing for future exploitation to happen. So 1939, 19 to 1945, we've got World War II. So um, we've got this lack of lack of employment workforce in the U.S. So then the administration at that time comes up with the Bracero program, and it starts. It was brought in originally to help with railway construction as well as farm labor. 1950, ag labor becomes eligible for old age and disability benefits. And then 1953, H2 foreign worker program begins. I do want to say that the Bracero program ends in 1964 because of repeated labor violations and exploitations through the system. So why the exclusions, right? Why do all these laws pass and yet farm workers or ag labor are excluded from it? And here is a very big example why. So it's basically racism rooted into our society in that era. So I'm going to read this quote. It's from Representative J. Mark Wilcox from Florida, debating over the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1937. So now I'm just going to read the bolden part, but you can read the rest if you want. But it says, "You cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it. Not only would such a situation result in a grave social and racial conflicts, but it would also result in throwing the Negro out of employment and making him a public charge." So you can see that from the get-go, even just lawmakers and people in charge of the nation don't want to exclude these people based on just race. Over like every time that ag workers might be considered, they are thrown out and excluded from any passing of the law, because it would throw the country into a social conflict. But something to think about with farm workers and the vulnerability that they have is that we've got isolation. There are people who are may not know the language, may not know English, which you can see it on the list as well. But they're also isolated. These farms, and I don't know where the majority of you are coming from, but in Indiana, a big rural state, there's farms that are going to be miles and miles and miles away from any sort of population. And then if you might have a neighbor, it might be like a few miles away, but then that neighbor isn't going to know your language, isn't going to know what you want, might not even be very fond of you. Working in this industry, or being maybe of a different nationality or of a different culture. Fear of retaliation is a big one. Their fear of speaking out and then the employer lashes out and says, well, you're fired, or even worse, like, I'm going to come after your family or anything like that. We've seen it all in the past. Immigration status, they're afraid of deportation. They're afraid of, well, I'm undocumented, or, I'm only here on a visa. They're afraid that they might, not be able to come back ever, or, get deported. um Lack of knowledge of laws, legal system, resources available, so they don't know the way our legal system works. They don't know the type of laws that exist in the US. They don't know any resources available to them. They don't know of any of our organizations. And language, like we spoke, they might speak Haitian Creole, Spanish, whatever it is. They don't know English as well as you and I do. So yeah, it would be tough. Lack of trust, that's a big one we see. Like, I go and talk to them and they're going to be like, who is this guy talking to me? What does he know? Right. So there's this, and this happens year after year when we visit these farms where, like, the workers are housed. We try to establish, like, next year I'll be back, next year I'll be back. And so it's this importance of building this rapport with the workers so that they can trust us. They'll be working from, you name it. They're working off hours. Now, I don't know how many of you work from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. If you do, I hope you get paid overtime. But these guys, like, they don't. I work 9 to 5, 8 to 5, depending. Um, they're not going to be able to reach me during my open hours, right? So that's why, at least at our place at ILS, we've got a specific phone that people take, and it's like an on-call at night kind of thing, and they can call us at whatever hours they need. Also, another vulnerability, right? Dangerous work and workplace injuries. We just have. I'm right now in Chicago, and we just had a heat wave. Like, it's yesterday or the day before yesterday. It was like, I don't know, 90 some degrees outside. Felt like 100. Now imagine working out in the field in this. It could be very dangerous, and injuries can happen all the time. And we see that happening all the time. So reliance on employer, recruiter for transportation, employment, housing, visa, wages, and other family members. So, and that one is going to be, the reliance on the employer to be able to take you, if you get injured, to the hospital. Is the employer, or your recruiter going to be like, oh yeah, let me just go ahead and leave everyone here, and then I'll take you to the hospital. A lot of times, unfortunately, that doesn't happen. And they don't have the proper transportation, or they might need, like, maybe it's not a healthcare need, but maybe it's like, I don't know, like, my kid needs a childcare, or whatever it may be that we think, like, well, I have my own car, I can do it. Sometimes farm workers, when they're brought over on visas, or if they're recruited from a different state and brought over, like, bussed over, like we constantly see and often see, they might be, they might not have their own private car to be able to take places. So employment, they're tied to this employer for employment. If they got transported here by them, you quit. What are you going to do? I'm not, an employer isn't going to be like, yeah, take the bus back home and then bring it back when you're done, right? Like, it's not going to happen that way. Housing, a lot of times, farm workers, and then I'm going to say a lot of times, I'm going to say this is probably 95% of the time, farm workers live on farm housing. They live on housing that the farmer or the recruiter or whoever provides. And it all depends if they charge you or not, depending on the contract. So if you are here on an H2A, which I'll get to in a little bit, you should not get charged for farm worker housing. That's included in the contract. But for, like, undocumented workers, which is, I think it's thought to be 50% of the farm worker workforce. Well, it used to be thought of that. I don't know if it's changed now, but 50% of the farm worker force used to be undocumented. It's harder to be able to reach out to those people, but yeah, their housing is usually charged for. They'll they should get a contract, and they should say on there how much they're going to be charged for, either weekly or monthly, for that housing. Reliance on a visa, your employer is tied to your visa. So if you have an H2A visa, your employer basically controls where you work, and that's it. You don't have any say about that. Wages, right? Reliance on your employer to pay you, right? Like I rely on my employer to pay me. Of course, my employer isn't super shady, so it's a little better. Also, if your family members have ever been hired by this employer slash recruiter, or they're employed by the same time you at the same time you are, there could be some familial retaliation, and they could also get um, fired or retaliated against. And then a big one we see as well is threats and myths, and across the same workers will be like, like, oh, I heard he hit someone, or I heard he has a gun, or I heard this. So these are myths that the employer uses to be able to I don't want to say the word control, but to be able to undermine them coming and coming forward to us and being like, hey, I have this issue or whatnot. And sometimes we have had cases, and I'll talk about those later, where there is a literal threat, like the employer is like, if you talk to this person, I will kill you. And unfortunately, it happens. And then another vulnerability, right? Exclusionary laws, right? A lot of guys work, 100-hour weeks, even more. And when that happens, they're like, should I be paid overtime? And you're like, well, unfortunately, in the US, no, right? Or anything like that, right? Um, So the H2A program. So the H2A program is a visa program that allows foreign workers from authorized countries to work temporarily in the U.S. in ag labor. So the H2A program is specific for ag labor. There's also the H2B program, which is non-ag labor. But we'll be talking today about the H2A program. So the H2A program started due to the lack of workers able and willing to work. And just so you know, the H2A program is eligible for U.S. based workers. So if anyone who is authorized to work in the United States would like to apply for an H2A job, they're able to. They're actually supposed to be considered first before foreign workers are. But sometimes there are exclusionary requirements, like a lot of times one of them is like drug screening, or a lot of times is like prior experience. So you have to have prior experience in ag labor, and a lot of times people who want to get started and work at an H2A level might not have that experience. If you're local around the area, you might not have that experience, and it's a way to keep you from applying to these jobs. So the H2A program at its inception had 30,000 visas like approved. In 2020, it had 213,000 approved, and that number keeps spiking up. That's 2020 is the last reliable number I had. I haven't looked to see a more updated number that I imagine that there is, at 2021 and 2022 one, and even 2023, since we're in 2024. But, that jump, some might think, well, it's not that big if it started in the 50s and now we're in, 2020, 70 years. But actually, the big spike happened in the last, I think, 10 years, has been where farmers have been able to switch over and, switch over from regular farm worker work or labor to H2A labor, because there's farmers have this issue, or yeah, they have this issue where people might abandon their job. And if that happens, then they're just left with crops rotting on the plants. Now, when you use H2A, your employees can't leave, because when they leave, you report it to the government. The government then takes action. But this is a way to have secured employment. The H2A workers are paid at what's called the adverse effect wage rate, and it differs by state. It is set by the Department of Labor. Um, the adverse effect wage rate, we call it AWER. You will be paid if the AWER is lower than your minimum wage in your state. or federally, which we know it's not, you will be paid at that higher rate. So if your state minimum wage is higher, you'll be paid at that higher rate. In Indiana, I know is $18.18 an hour for the A work. So that's what you're supposed to get paid if you're an H2A worker per hour. There's constant revisions and updates to the H2A program. There were just some passed earlier this year. So it's constantly under revision and updates to try and better the system. And then, of course, the H2A program is certified by state workforce agencies, the Employment Training Administration, and DOL. So these are all the different agencies that need to look, make sure that everything is fine. So like the state workforce agency, when a contract is filed, they have, like the Department of Health in Indiana then inspects the housing, make sure the housing is okay, etc. And then it goes back to the ETA for certification. So issues within the H2A program. So the first and biggest issue is employer type visa. If you come and work for someone you don't know, an employer, they don't give you like an interview. So you don't get to see who you're going to be working with. You don't know if he'll be a good guy or bad guy. If you don't like him, you have the option to keep working or to go back home. There is an option to transfer your visa to another employer, but that you have to get permission from your current employer to transfer to a different employer. And yeah, with the type of employers that I've dealt with in this line of work, it's not like they're just, yeah, go ahead, leave, like they usually are very um, upset and be like, no, you can't. One second, drink some water. Another issue that we see is recruitment fees, which are definitely illegal, but definitely happen. In 2013, I know that's old now, we're like 11 years of forward, but in 2013, it was said that 50, and this is a stat coming from the CDM, which is the Centro de Derechos Migrantes in Mexico. They went around and interviewed different H2A workers, and they estimated that around 50% of H2A workers were charged a recruitment fee. Um, that isn't supposed to happen, right? No recruitment fees. I wouldn't be surprised if that's higher now because anyone I talk to has been charged a recruitment fee in Mexico. Unless the only way you don't get charged a recruitment fee, which I've seen, is if you're coming back with the same employer. If you're coming back with the same employer, the employer already has your information. They just re-petition you. But yes, and the reason recruitment fees are so like the way they're awful and why they are issues within the program is because once you pay a recruitment fee, it has you're charged I don't know $1,000 or whatever you're charged. Any amount is too much because you're not supposed to be charged anything. But when you're charged something, it then puts on the worker, it puts a burden of not being able to, make that minimum wage that you're supposed to make by law in the US. So then there's like the minimum wage violations, and then there's going to be, well, first the recruitment fee violations. But so that's why it's like a debt bondage type of thing as well. So recruitment fees are just this big issue that happens. A lot of times we've seen inadequate housing. They come and they'll get housed. Like we've had clients get housed in barns, just straight up on the floor barns. Mattresses on the floor, hay still around, dirt still around, some animals still around. We've had, houses that like look like sheds that were like built, in the 1800s, and people are sleeping there. We've seen nice houses too. I don't want to say that every housing that's a farm worker or H2A worker housing is going to be awful, but we've seen nice houses too, right? Like completely new with top of the line stuff. Sometimes they're housed in like townhouses, which is like amazing. But the majority of the time they're not. Like there's still an employer in Indiana who uses outhouses without plumbing. So you can get an idea of, yeah, I don't know. I've never used an outhouse and I'm glad I never have to. Or hopefully I need to knock on wood. But Yeah, it's just inadequate housing is a big problem within the H2A program. Isolation again, you see, and a lot of these will be repeated from the last one because H2A workers are farm workers. So isolation, they get brought to where they're going to be working, and then they're like, "All right, you're here." So sometimes they might be bused to like a Walmart for shopping or Western Union for sending money back home, but the majority of the time they're in this housing, miles and miles away from any civilization. They're afraid of retaliation. They're afraid, these myths and threats get thrown around, and they're afraid that if they say something, they'll get, hurt, and then it's on the other side, blacklisted. They might not be able to ever come back with an H2A employer because, they get blacklisted. They get, put on this list where like no recruiter will ever approach them or anything. Fear of deportation. They're afraid that like, when they reach out to us or they reach out to any other organization, they might cause more problems for them instead of solutions. So one of the problems being deportation. They don't know who is ICE or who isn't ICE. They don't know that ICE is on their side or against their side, right? They don't know anything about this. Transportation, they're brought to, these remote farms in the middle of nowhere, and then they're just kind of like, yeah, have fun. I don't know, like, there's a lot of times there would be this big bus that only one person can drive, and he'll have to bus around the workers. But other than that, there's no really any transportation. Now we have seen some employers start to provide cars, like they'll provide like small cars for them to use whenever they're not working or things like that, but they'll provide like one car for like 300 workers. Now how does that, who gets to pick what car they use, right? Like, or who uses the car first or whatever. And then again, reliance on employer. The H2A visa, like I said, it's employer tied, so anything you want to do is employer based. So imagine if you work 6 to 10 and you need to go, you get a broken tooth or something, or a cavity and it hurts really bad, or your wisdom teeth are coming in and you need to go to the dentist. A lot of times they're afraid to ask the employer, be like, "Hey, I need to go to the dentist," or sometimes there might be that language access issue again. They might not know how to ask, and they'll just deal with the pain until they get back home, which sometimes can be really bad, right? Like I don't know if anyone has had a toothache or any type of like um, medical issue that you might need resolved. So yeah. Um, so and then we'll talk about real fast labor trafficking within, well, not real fast. This is the main thing. Labor trafficking within the H2A. So this is probably the biggest story out there. This is Operation Blooming Onion, where the recruiters, these were FLCs, which are different than farmers. So farmers are employers, but FLCs are also employers, which stands for Farm Labor Contractors, FLCs. I'll be using that a lot from now on. So just so you know. So Operation Blooming Onion was a operation that had a smuggling of 200 plus workers that happened over the South and went all the way up even into Wisconsin and Michigan, I believe. And you can look more into this. I'm just going to go into like a brief type of um, discussion about this, but smuggling of 200 plus workers obtained H2A visas for the workers and forced workers to work for little to no pay. They sold and traded the workers. So once they were done with them in one state, they brought them to another state. And even though the H2A visa said that they couldn't be in that state, they brought them and they sold them for a price, and then they worked. Some workers died. The abuses were reported in 2016 by one worker, right? They were reported in 2016 by one worker. They were the conviction and everything happened, or not conviction, but everything was brought forward in 2021. So you can imagine 5 years of just waiting for something to happen, right? Just waiting, you're one worker, you reported in 2016, and then it goes all the way till 2020s, 4 or 5 years after, and then something happens. That would be frustrating. Mostly if you were, not for you don't know how much of that time you won't be allowed to work. You're looking over your back because you're afraid retaliation is going to happen, right? All the threats that you heard while you were working, the people that died, you think that you're going to die. So all this psychological terror is happening, and then now imagine dealing with that for 4 to 5 years. The defendants requested more than 71,000 visas over the South in a 6-year period, and only 200 workers were, the smuggling was found for 200 workers. Now, I'd like to believe that that number is higher, but we weren't able to get every single one of them. Yeah. So this is one of the more I think CNN picked it up as well. Like they made a whole post about it. So um not all the cases look like this, but we never want a case to ever look like this, right? Like I feel bad for these workers that they ever went through this. Mourn the lives of those who died. And it's just sad to think that like they come here to help us, right? They come here to feed us because the crops that they're harvesting, the crops that they're growing benefit us as Americans and as people who live in the US, right? Um, so another thing that I saw in the report was that they were even, I believe, corralled in, like there was an electric fence around the farm so that they wouldn't be able to leave in one of the many farms that they worked in. And we've had similar cases like this where, um, employer must provide, like a kitchenette for you to be able to cook, or like and with along with that, trips to the grocery store ever so often so that you can cook. And if they don't provide that, then they have to provide food for you 3 times a day. And then there's an amount they can charge in the contract, but it's 3 times per day. We've seen where workers were not fed at all for days, or like even 1 to 2 days, and they were eating crops in the fields or things like that. Um, so yeah, and then labor trafficking within the H2A, right? Cases like such appear year after year. I think it's rare that we don't see a case like this happen every year. Labor violations are prevalent, right? No food, like I was saying, no pay. They'll be, working without pay for the longest time. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried leaving somewhere without money, but it's hard. Mostly if you need, like, and if you don't have a car, walking, anything, it's difficult when you're tied to these employers. Inadequate housing, of course, undisclosed housing location. So under your contract, it has a section for you to, or for the employer to disclose the housing locations for H2A workers. We'll find workers who are not living in the place that they're supposed to be living. We found workers that were supposed to be living in Ohio, sorry, living in Ohio, and we found them in the middle of nowhere in Indiana. We found workers that were supposed to be, they thought they were in Louisiana. They were in the middle of nowhere in Indiana. So Louisiana to Indiana is quite a bit, right? But I mean, what do they don't know the United States geographically, right? So sure, Indiana to them is Louisiana, right? Wage violations such as underpaid or not paid at all, not paid for travel expenses, or charge illegal deductions, which happens very often. The travel expenses will be like paying for your visa. Sometimes if an employer doesn't pay up front, you'll have to pay for it while you're in Mexico, and then, or whatever country you're coming from, and then on your first paycheck, the employer is supposed to reimburse all of that. We've seen a lot of times where that doesn't happen, and that creates that debt bondage where you're, if you took a loan out and where you're from to get this visa, now you're just kind of without, without that money and can't pay it back, which you don't know, like if you put any collateral or anything back home, they might take that. They might, uh, threaten your family to pay. They might, whatever. Threats of violence or deportation or no future employment. So threats of violence we see all the time, like it's one of our cases, right? We've got a guy who's like, I'm going to kill anyone who speaks out and denounces me, you're going to get deported. I'm going to call ICE and you're going to get deported immediately. Or I'm going to call everyone. You're not ever going to get employed again. And these are, when you are relying on this income of coming to the U.S. and working in the U.S., for to be able to send it back to your families and then go back to to Mexico or to the country that you came from and then come back the next year, you know, that is a big you know thought process when these guys are trying to come forward. They might be like, no, I'm actually not going to report it. And we've had that happen, right? We've had a guy who was working and he lost part of his finger. We advised them on, advised them on the workers' comp, information that is available to all workers in the U.S. And they chose not to pursue it. They lost part of a finger. They would have gotten compensation for it for permanent injury, and they chose not to pursue it because of the fear of no future employment. Um, yeah, so it happens. Employers deny workers access to service providers. So service providers like me, legal services, sometimes not even legal services. I could see why they might not want me there, right? If they're doing something wrong, but healthcare, people who are wanting to do glucose checks or blood pressure checks or anything like that. Um, We've seen education providers. We partner with different organizations like Migrant Education, Proteus, which is I think in like 2 or 3 different states, and they do heat stress safety and pesticide safety trainings for farm workers, and they'll deny access to all these beneficial service providers for their workers because they're afraid that if they're doing something wrong, it'll come forward and they'll be fined or whatnot. um so yeah. This is some of the labor trafficking issues that we in Indiana have seen, and I'll go ahead and go through them. These are some cases. I can't discuss a lot of details, but I can definitely be super vague about them. So workers were housed inadequately. They were not paid for months. When Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division investigated, employer threatened to kill them if they spoke. So, oh, misspelled that. So immediately, right? Right off the bat, threat. Um, Another case, workers made to work outside of their visa status, and that means um, if a worker, like your visa isn't like just for a undetermined amount of time. Like no, the employer is going to say, I need you from May to June, and they'll say like a specific day. um, what happened in this case is that they didn't file an extension. They didn't do anything for the worker. So then the worker kept working because he thought that there was an extension filed, and he thought that he was going to keep working because that's what he was told. That never happened. So they became out of status. They became basically an undocumented worker at that time. And then an accident happened that resulted in death. And then workers intimidated against coming forward. Uh, there's another one that workers were made to work outside of authorized employment locations. So, and they were not paid and not fed. So workers were working, A, in location A, and then employers like, well, actually, I need some work done in location B. Location B was never disclosed in their contract. So that's a violation of the H2A regulations. And they, of course, not paid and not fed. Um, Workers brought through H2B program, which is the non-ag labor program, were made to work in a farm that the employer also owned, but worked outside of a visa classification. So when you are brought through H2A or H2B, you are supposed to do the type of job that visa says. You're not supposed to do any other type of job. So, and that happens a lot with landscaping workers. Landscaping workers, sometimes are made to work in greenhouses and water plants and grow trees. That is actually an H2B classification because you are growing something that is, ag labor. But then they'll also be made to go plant the tree, in a yard somewhere for a client. That then becomes H2B, and yeah, so this classification is wrong. Give me 1 second. Hmm. Yeah. So these, yeah. So we've been able to get different, legal avenues and legal relief for these workers. So what to do? I've given you all the problem. I've given you everything that's wrong and happens bad. What do you do now? You collaborate. So we've got community organizations, right? I'm a community organization. I work for Indiana Legal Services, but legal services providers like Indiana Legal Services exist across the nation, right? Michigan has like three, I think. Wisconsin, I don't know how many they have, but I know one. Um, Illinois has like two or three. So all across, Florida has a few. Um, So all across the US, there are these organizations that are legal services providers, and they're willing to help, right? We're here. That's what we're here for. We're willing to be able to provide them with legal services that will create a relief for the workers so that they don't have to further suffer. Coalitions is another one, right? I'm a member of like two coalitions, and one of them is specific, and it's called the Indiana Migrant and Seasonal Farm Worker Coalition, and it's made up of 13 different organizations, some of them being our local EEOC, our local Department of Labor, and our local state workforce agencies. And then, of course, unions. We've got a lot, and then this might pertain more to non-ag labor, but there's some ag unions over in California, I think, and they might be able to, they might be willing to help or whatnot. But in Indiana, we've got a union that helps with like carpentry and construction, and that union is always looking out for workers that are non-union and might be hired under false pretenses or things like that, and we get referrals from them. So reaching out to these different organizations is a way to be able to more holistically or whatever help um workers combat this wrongdoing. So federal departments that we also collaborate with, right? Department of Justice, United or the U.S. Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division is one of their biggest collaborators. Department of Homeland Security, it's like their investigations division, FBI, the Office of Trafficked persons. I can't remember what the I stands for. OTIP, EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the NLRB, and many more. I'm pretty sure there's some I missed, but there's also different like federal funded organizations that might not be federal departments, but like we have one in Indiana called Exodus, and they help with refugee and trafficking resettlement. We also have the Indiana Coalition to End, Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking, IKESA HT, and they are big on human trafficking in providing services and reliefs. State departments such as state workforce agencies, state Department of Labors, and state OSHA. These are all organizations that are very helpful. Yeah, when you need something investigated or something you think something you need to report something. And then, of course, national consulates. The Mexican consulate is one of our dear friends at Indiana Legal Services, and of course, Honduran consulate, and et cetera. Like any nationality that you have, they're always able to help. And how are they able to help, right? What can they do? So community organizations can provide support for survivors, and that can be in housing, in monetary funds, food, legal avenues for relief. So like we always look to see if they're foreign workers, like H2A workers. We always try to find a way to like find a relief for them, right? They've suffered this, now they're survivors, and now what can we do? What we do is we find immigration services, like a T visa, which is specific for human trafficking. And so we help them, we advocate for them, we report for them alongside them at law enforcement agencies like federal departments. Housing, like there's a lot of housing organizations like shelters. Sometimes the consulates can provide monetary funds to be able to help with housing. Monetary funds for discretionary spending, right? They might need to still send money back home because they might have kids, they might have families. Food, like food shelter, or not shelters, food, food pantries, there we go. That they can, get some free food so that they don't have to spend their monetary funds and they can send them back home. Federal departments can investigate and bring forward charges for trafficker and bar companies from future potential employment certification, and also obtain restitution for back wages. So Department of Labor, right, can obtain, like any unpaid wage, any wage theft violation. And then of course, like the Department of Homeland Security can, investigate and bring forward charges for traffickers. They can also provide certifications for your survivor, your client, to be able to get legal relief. Because once the employment ends with the work, like with the employer, once you leave, you fall out of status. These different federal departments can give your client, what's called continued presence, and it's while it's being investigated, they'll be able to be within status and not deported or taken. Yeah. State departments can also help investigate and file what is a DOS, or discontinuation of services, to guilty parties. So that means that they won't be able to file for another petition through our state or that state until they resolve the issue that's being investigated or being complained about. They are also sometimes not as swamped as federal departments, so that might be another option for if you need a quick response on something. But sometimes they might not have the exact jurisdiction or the exact power that federal departments can. And then of course, consulates can provide support for survivors, monetary funds, food, legal avenues for relief as well. But yeah. And then so hope for the future. In operations like Blooming Onion or any other trafficking cases, the guilty parties are always direct employers and not higher up. So it's always, what I said were the FLCs. So in every case, it says right here, it is always a farmer/employer benefiting from the trafficking, yet only FLCs are brought to justice. So only farm labor contractors are ever brought to justice. So a way to be able to combat this in the future is, a farmer and employer might be the higher, the higher collar or whatever they want to call it or whatnot, because they're the ones that keep hiring the FLCs who are using, trafficking methods to get their labor. And they might say, "Oh, we didn't know about it." I'd like to, when they keep hiring over and over again, which is what happened with one of the, I believe, Blooming Onion employers, yet nothing was brought against them. So we'll see. And I know sometimes it's based on law or based on whatever joint employer definition is at the time. Yeah, and so the pattern will continue, but the hope is the regulations keep changing and they keep getting tougher. So regulations just changed and they got real tough, and I love it. But yeah, thank you so much for letting me present to you all. It was a pleasure. I hope you learned something. And yeah, is there any questions? I actually don't know.
Yes, we have two questions so far. And just a reminder, if you have questions for Leo, please put them in the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen next to show captions. So the first question, Leo, is, are there any programs that would prevent someone from leaving the site itself? I have had family tell me that they are not allowed to leave the location.
Any programs, is that what they said?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so they're and then this is just a clarification, I guess. And so if they're working with an employer and they're at a site, they so the, it's always such an issue because camp access, which is labor camps, is where like the farm workers live. That's what it's called. I know it sounds awful, but that's just the name of it. So labor camps, there's always this camp access. Like, are you allowed to go in there or are they allowed to leave? When COVID-19 happened, they kind of put their fist down and said, no one's leaving because of COVID-19, and we don't want people to die and we don't want people to get sick. At the same time, employers or US-based workers were able to leave and go to Walmart and go everywhere. So they weren't afraid to bring COVID themselves. So now the issue happens that they kept doing that. They realized that they were allowed to do that and no one said no. So what we've seen is that they keep doing that over and over again. in, at different labor camps or whatnot. So I don't know if programs that, allow them to leave or whatnot. They should be allowed to leave. You're not allowed to be confined to a one location, and that's, I think, pretty sure that's called slavery. But I could. It's sometimes something that needs to go up the chain. Up in might be something that needs to be like sued, or like Department of Labor might need to be brought in and been like, you need to report it, and so this is a big thing with us. It's as long as the employee wants to report it, we can report it. We don't do anything without their consent. One, because we're legal services, and two, because we don't want to make anything worse for them that than it already is. But yeah, I don't know if that answered the question or not. Hopefully it did.
And the next one is there a website or a way to find out the minimum pay that H2A farm workers can be paid? Could that amount be included in their visa paperwork?
It is included in the visa paperwork. It's always supposed to be included. It does change every year around the February, March time, that spring time. It always changes. Well, that's a lie. It doesn't always change, but if it does change, it changes then. So like last year in Indiana, it was $17.17 an hour. If anyone put in a petition or a contract during January, like 1st of January, it would show that wage rate. But then once it changes, if that contract is for, till November, from when it changed to November, they're supposed to get paid that new wage rate. And it is on a website, and I can try to look it up real fast. But it's, if you just, what I usually do is I just go on Google and I type in AWR. So it's AEWR, and then wage. And then it should bring up what's this website, and it's flag.dol.gov. And then it has every single state's AWRs, and you can see, and it has like the current year and the change. So, and it has like all of them on there. Yeah. I don't know.
And then outside of direct outreach, what are some of the best outreach efforts you've seen, i.e. posters in certain locations?
So we've done posters, and we always do posters or business cards, or what we like to call palm cards. They're these small cards that we created that fit in your palm so that people can sneak them out in case, I got the idea from my wife when she used to work at a domestic violence victim advocates agency, because a lot of times they'll have to sneak them, and so we'll drop them off at like Mexican stores where like Western Union is, or where they'll send money back home. We'll drop them off at cash, but sometimes it's like the same, the Mexican stores sometimes cash checks. A lot of times they've been getting paid digitally, which is a lot harder. Other things that we've done is we'll do um partner organizations will want, like migrant education, like I mentioned. They actually just invited me on Thursday to an event that they're having for migrant parents or migrant adults that are wanting to learn English or whatnot, and they allow me to do presentations for their clients or whatnot. And a lot of times those people then know people, and then it just gets thrown around everywhere. So I try to do as many presentations to like organizations that might not be so controversial to go to a camp access. But like if I was to go to like a farmers camp, and I asked for permission, which I never do, but if I did, they'd be like, who are you with? And I can't lie about that, so I'd be like, I'm with Indiana Legal Services. Immediately they'd be like, no, get out of here. But um what I do is I give all of my information to all these partner organizations. So we have like the East Coast Migrant Head Start, Migrant Education, Proteas is one of the ones I mentioned, the Mexican Consulate. All these organizations are less likely to be like denied access. And once they're in, they'll give my information out as well. And they'll be like, hey, if you have any problem, this guy will help you. Another thing, like I said, coalitions. I'm a part of like 2 coalitions, and they'll always have events, and the coalition is a great way to Trojan horse yourself into a camp, because they'll host events for farm workers, and we'll call it a resource event, where we're thanking them. We're thanking farm workers for everything you do. And while we are, I get to go in there and be like, hey, if you have any issues, this is what we do. And I have my own booth and everything. And yeah, and so that's one of the ways that we do it. Yeah. And yeah, if you have any other way that you don't, that I haven't mentioned and maybe I don't know, let me know, because I'm always looking for different ways. I just realized I forgot to put my information on the last slide.
We can make sure that it'll be included in the materials that get sent out in the next few days. So that'll include the PowerPoint and then Leo, your contact information.
Awesome.
And we have two more questions, and then we will sign off. So the next one is, do you know what kind of information employers are given before hiring through the H2A program? I assume they are knowingly breaking these laws, but wanted to see if any kind of awareness raising would alleviate any of the issues.
A good question. I actually don't know what information they're getting. A lot of times they use third-party companies to file these contracts, these H2A orders. And when they do that, they just kind of like, I don't want to deal with it, right? Because a lot of times these are like, they're big farms, but they'll still be like family employed or family owned. So it's like these people who might not know how to fill out all this paperwork. So that's why they hire this third party company that does it. And they might not know all of the H2A regulations that they have to follow, which are on the bottom of the contract that they fill out, right? They're on the bottom. They say on there everything you have to do. But I think I don't really know like a correct answer, but bringing awareness to them that like, hiring even contractors that do, like that have any trafficking or any wrongdoing might put them at risk or whatnot, and if it doesn't put them at legal risk, like what's to say that like a media outlet isn't going to like get the story and then be like, this local farm uses trafficking labor or whatnot. That I imagine for if I owned a company, that would be bad for me, right? Like I wouldn't want that to be a thing. But yeah, so just I don't know, giving them the prevention of like, if you do use a farm labor contractor, be sure you know who you use. But yeah.
All right, and then our last question is, could H2A workers be restricted from leaving the state to see family?
Leaving the state, what?
Leaving the state to see family.
Uh, I mean, as long as they have the time, like if it's like an hour drive, no, I don't see why. They have the freedom to do it. I like to think of it this way. And now this is going to be a debate because it's not a clear cut, dry, like white and black question. Like that's the issue with this whole camp access and, ability to leave. But, like they're in the US, they're here legally for the amount of time that they're here. They should be able to do what anyone legally in the US should be able to do. So if I'm able to leave my employer, during lunchtime to go eat wherever I want, they should have the same right. Now, the issue comes, will they be able to be back within work time, right? Will they be able to be back rested and able to work at the ability that they worked in the past or whatever, in with that employer? Then I don't know. Like I would say yes. And if I was an H2A employer, or employee, I would try it. But I'm not, and yeah, I don't have as much to lose, right? I'm a U.S. citizen as of a year ago, so I'm able to say whatever I want now. But yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Well, Leo, thank you so much for this presentation. It was super informative. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else on the phone did as well. Everyone, just to reiterate, we will be sending out the PowerPoint presentation. The recording of this will be posted on NCDC's YouTube page within a couple of weeks. And when we send out the PowerPoint, we will send out Leo's contact information as well. So he is happy to answer your questions if you reach out to him directly.
Sorry, guys. I'm looking at the chat, and it's like some people I know. I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't know. Hey, look, Terry. That's Department of Workforce Development. Oh my goodness. Anyway, thank you so much, guys. It was great. I love presenting. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks again, Leo.